Hi everyone, this is the first lecture of week 11, and this is of course a shortened week. And again, a reminder to keep up with your readings in the biblical text. Like I said, I'm going to be going over things very, very quickly, and it's not going to make a lot of sense without reading the stories in the biblical text first. Also, because this is a shortened week, the material from these videos will show up not on the quiz for this week. You don't have a quiz this week, but will show up on the quiz for the next week, which will be our last week of class. Okay. Last time we left off with the death of Solomon. With his death, we transitioned from a time of the United Monarchy when the North and the South were ruled together by one Davidic king, to now the time of the Divided Monarchy. Okay, where the North, Israel, Samaria, or just plain, the North. Okay, composed of 10 tribes of Israel, will be ruled by a different king than the South, okay? Or Judah, sometimes it's known, which will consist of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and will continue to be ruled by a descendant of of David, okay? Also called a Davidite or a Davidic king. Okay, so with the divided monarchy, you have basically the splitting of the North and the South, and the rule of these two areas by different people. Okay, like I said, the South will continue to be ruled by a Davidic king. Okay, that is someone from the line of David, while the North will be ruled by a series of kind of sporadic rulers. Okay, and this sporadic rulership in the North, it has a kind of particular effect. Okay, and what it does is that it leads to the particular prominence of northern prophets. Okay, prophecy becomes very, very, very strong in the North. Okay, and indeed, even famous southern prophets, such as Isaiah, they will borrow a lot of their materials and ideas from originally northern prophets, such as Hosea. Okay, so remember that prophets are essentially messengers or emissaries of God. They're kind of the in-between intermediaries between God and the people, and God and the king. Okay, and that's in part why they arose at the same time as kingship. Okay, remember that prophets really emerge when kings do in Israel. Why? So that they can act as a counterweight to the voice and authoritarian kind of powers of the human king, right? To insert God's voice, okay? And indeed, so the usual understanding of prophets and the wrong understanding of prophets is that they're fortune tellers or future tellers, okay? When in reality, it's not really what they were. They did tell the future, but, it doesn't seem like they really tell kind of the long term future per se, as much as most of what you see them do is tell the kind of immediate future right after a battle or something like that. Okay, rather the main job of prophets were to be kind of present tellers. Okay, their main job was really to call out society, against injustice and inequality. Really, they were supposed to act as kind of conduits of God's voice. Okay, and God was not necessarily as concerned about the future, right, as about the bad things that were happening in human society now. Okay, so that's really the primary job of a prophet. Okay, like I said, a prophecy was particularly strong in the North. Okay, and the reason why a lot of people think that that's the case is because of two reasons. One is because the North Israel was the kind of richer area. And as a result, there was, anytime a country becomes rich, it also becomes very, very, very unequal. Okay, so that's probably in part why prophecy was strong. Okay, but mainly the reason why prophecy was stronger in the North was because, remember, in contrast to the South, right, you don't really have in the North this very strong tradition of kingship. Okay, in the South, the David and the Davidic covenant and the Davidic descendants, they were probably so strong, so entrenched in power, that many prophets in the South might have been co-opted. Okay, the South, in short, was full of royalists. Okay, the North never developed that kind of royal tradition. Okay, instead, they developed this kind of counter tradition of prophetic, almost counter argument. Okay. So notice, for example, speaking to this kind of divide, how there's no prophets mentioned during the time of Solomon. okay? As if, you have such a, grasp on authoritarian powers there. The tight control that Solomon had, really, it didn't allow, prophecy to flourish, okay? Unsurprisingly, it is only after Solomon's death and only after the kingdoms divide, okay, and you get this kind of sporadic kingship in the north, that you find true stories about the first fully fledged prophets of Israel, namely Elijah and his protege, that's similarly and confusingly named Elisha. Okay, two figures who I'm going to talk about later in the video are depicted as doubles. Okay, notice that that Elijah and Elisha are also active in the north, again for all those reasons that I named. Okay, and what's important about Elijah and Elisha, but Elijah in particular, is that Elijah has a robust afterlife, okay, what they call a Nachleben, okay, the afterlife, post-biblical afterlife, where he becomes an incredibly important figure. And it's because of this afterlife that you'll see Elijah being referenced all over the New Testament, for example, okay? I'll talk about that maybe in another video, later video or something, okay? Now, indeed, the northern prophets were, much more forceful about expressing their opposition to kings, okay? And indeed, many of them, a lot of people sort of try to figure out what the difference between the northern prophets were, or why the prophecy was so prominent in the north. Some argue that the northern prophets, instead of following the Davidic covenant, remember the Davidic covenant where God promises to always dwell in Jerusalem in the temple and always to kind of protect the divine line of kings from David, instead of following this idea or this covenant, a lot of people argue that the northern prophets, or prophets maybe in general, lean towards a different understanding. They instead follow something called the Sinaitic covenant, that is the covenant given at Sinai during the Exodus. And remember that this covenant promised blessings for the exclusive worship of Yahweh and terrible things for the worship of other deities, okay? Notice how similar the Sinaitic covenant and these prophetic ideas, are with the ideas found in Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history, which also incidentally, right, is very focused on you following the covenant, right? Indeed, some argue that Deuteronomy and Deuteronomistic history, though kind of edited by somebody in the South or updated by somebody in the South, really originally might have been northern, okay? A lot of people speculate, I agree with them, my own opinion, is that that the Deuteronomistic history really begins when scribes from the north flee, okay, after the destruction of the north in 722, and bring with them these elements, okay, and it becomes kind of fused together, okay. You don't need to know all that, I'm just telling you why the north might have a stronger tradition of prophecy, okay. Once the period of the divided monarchy begins, the stories that follow in First Kings and Second Kings, like I said in the last video, kind of toggle back and forth by describing the situation in the north, and then description in the south, and description in the north, and so forth. Okay, and we begin with the north first at First Kings 16. Okay, where we are told that again a series of different kings control the north, showing how chaotic and unruly the government in Samaria is, okay? Unlike in the south, with the Davidic dynasty that will continue to rule until the south is destroyed, in the north, really the closest thing you get to a kind of dynasty or stable leadership, I guess, or rulership from the same family is this group of kings from the line of Omri called the Omride dynasty, okay? And the Omride dynasty will, that's where you find the most famous northern king, maybe famous because of Moby Dick, King Ahab. Okay, and we're going to talk about King Ahab, quickly in the next couple of videos. Okay, now, as I stated in last week, the South, because of course they are the last country to remain standing, and because this is where the editors come from, the South will always regard the North, okay, as a bunch of rebels, okay, and heretics, okay, and as a result, because the text is edited by Southern writers, okay, the texts that we have a particular bias, okay, and no Northern king will ever be declared good, no matter how successful they might have been in real life, okay, so again, what we have in First and Second Kings is not an unbiased text. This is a very biased text. okay? So in this video shortly, I'm going to kind of set the scene for the story of one of the most famous northern kings, that is namely Ahab, okay? And of course, Ahab, whose rule of North Israel or Samaria or Israel, whatever, okay, is passed along to him by his father Omri. Omri, okay, and both Ahab and Omri, of course, would be judged negatively by the Southern biblical writer, okay. However, like I said in the last video, by this point in history, that is around the 7th century BCE, we start getting some extra archaeological evidence from Israel's neighbors, and now we can actually start to compare. And what we find, of course, is that when you start looking at Omri and to some degree Ahab, they were not as bad a king as the biblical text suggests, okay, really. And for example, with Omri, we have the mention of Omri in this archaeological source called the Mesha stone or the Moabite stone, which is around from the 9th century or so. And according to the 840 BCE dated, and according to the Moabite stone, Omri seems to have ruled and conquered the Moabites. And this seems to indicate that he was actually a very successful king. Okay. In short, this is a long way of saying you want to read the biblical text, as always, with a grain of salt. Okay, this is a very particular take on the ancient history of Israel. Okay, you know, and one of the biggest tendency of the Southern biblical writer is that they did not like Northern kings. Okay, so you know they don't like Omri nor his son Ahab. Okay, however, you know, the dislike that these writers had, again, you know, of Omri and Ahab, this is nothing in comparison to the utter hatred they feel towards particular females associated with the northern kingdom, okay? In particular, Jezebel. Okay, Jezebel is a Phoenician princess, a foreign princess who marries Ahab and becomes queen. And Jezebel will make the biblical writers like literally foam at the mouth with hatred. Okay, so why do they hate her so much? And this is what we're going to be talking about in the next video. Okay, well, what we know of Jezebel is that she, like I said, was from Phoenicia. She was a Phoenician princess, and Phoenicia was a very, very, very rich city. Okay, so she's a foreigner, she's a woman. This is problematic, okay, but most importantly, she is super religious, which you would think the biblical writers would like, right? I mean, you know, she's religious, right? That's how a woman should be, right? I guess, is according to biblical writer. But the problem is that Jezebel is a great devotee, not of Yahweh, but of another Canaanite deity called Baal. Okay, indeed, she's so devout, some have wondered whether she was a kind of priestess of Baal. And who the heck is Baal? Okay, well, like I said, Baal is a Canaanite a deity. He is in particular a storm god. Okay, and he also is said to, he is described as kind of riding on the clouds and is also represented by a bull. Okay, notice how, well, I mean, you're beginning to see what the problem with Baal is, right? Or what the problems the biblical writers have with Baal. Baal, the Canaanite storm god, is unfortunately super duper similar to Yahweh, the Israelite storm god, who is also represented by a bull and who is also said to ride on clouds. Actually, they're almost indistinguishable, okay? And hence, that's a big problem. Because who do you know who is the true God, the true storm god, if you cannot separate the two, okay? And indeed, and this is a big problem, right? Much of the stories in First Kings will center on trying to assert how it is Yahweh, yeah, Yahweh, 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 not Baal, though it looks like Baal, who is a true storm god, okay? Or maybe a nicer way of putting it is the stories in Kings are centered on the rivalry between Yahweh and Baal, okay? So the problem with Jezebel, like I said, is that she is a woman, she is foreign, she is also royal, and remember, royalty were kind of the opponents, natural opponents of prophets, okay? And most importantly, the problem with Jezebel was that she worshipped, was a devotee of a god that looks and feels and seems just like Yahweh, but is not Yahweh. Okay, and therefore her worship really had the potential to confuse everybody. Okay, and like I said, she is not just like a kind of passive religious person. She is a super devotee and is not shy about trying to evangelize, you know, not shy about her religiosity. Okay, and of course, this, you know, the fact that she is a kind of active devotee, active religious, you know, foreign princess or queen, you know, this this brings her into direct conflict with a little prophet who is named Elijah. Okay. Elijah, and his name means "my God is Yahweh." It's super fitting, right? Is of course a super important figure in the biblical text. Okay. We have some descriptions of Elijah. 2 Kings 1, verse 8 describes Elijah as wearing a garment of hair with a leather belt, a description that will be reused in the New Testament to describe John the Baptist, who really is imagined as a new Elijah. Okay, Elijah in the Hebrew text is described in lots of interesting ways. Again, I don't have time to go over it. I would highly recommend you read the text, stories about Elijah. Elijah, for example, again, in these fantastic stories are described as kind of magically having control over nature, being fed by animals and birds. He's depicted as a miracle worker. You see him kind of resurrecting children, resurrecting people from the dead. He's kind of regenerating food. He is the messenger of the true storm god Yahweh, and so he's a kind of rain bringer, right? He anoints kings. He predicts kind of battle and political situation. He just is this kind of superpower guy. He's like a what I call superhero, right? With and what's in short, the important things about what Elijah does and Elijah's qualities as described in the text of First Kings is again how much they are reused in later texts, in particular in the New Testament. And what you'll see, one argument is that Jesus, when you look at the miracles that Jesus does or what Jesus is doing, there's a pretty good argument that he is really envisioned as a reborn Elijah. Okay. Indeed, and I'll discuss in a later video why later figures were imagined as kind of Elijah reborn or a second Elijah, and that has to do with the fact that he doesn't really die. Okay. Now, for our purposes here, okay, the important thing to know about Elijah is that he is a super fan of Yahweh, okay, and in short, Elijah is like the oppositional twin of Jezebel, okay. Jezebel is a foreigner, royal woman who is a super devotee of the storm god Baal. Elijah, in contrast, is an Israelite man who is a prophet, that is an opponent of royalties, right? Or the person that goes against royalty, who is a super devotee of the storm god Yahweh. Okay, and as such, these figures take on oppositional symbolism. Jezebel really becomes the ultimate bad guy, okay, the ultimate antagonist, the symbol of the illegal Baal worship in Israel, so detested by the Deuteronomistic author. Okay, and of course, in contrast, the prophet Elijah will be the ultimate good guy, the protagonist of the story, who symbolizes and indeed functions as the messenger of, representative of Yahweh, the true God of rain, and the true God of Israel. Okay, because of the characterization of Elijah and Jezebel as opposites and both as kind of religious fanatics, which is what they are. Okay, I mean, super devotees, like a nice way of saying they're religious fanatics, really. They of course, as fanatics, quickly come into conflict. And we are told they begin a religious war where each side try to massacre as many religious personnel of the other side as possible. Okay, and in particular, Elijah and Jezebel are known for two main conflicts, which I will describe very quickly here. Again, I'm condensing a lot of text. Okay, the first kind of conflict is this kind of battle of the prophets that happens on Mount Carmel, and it's described in 1 Kings 18. And if you go to Israel, you can actually go to the mountain on where this battle happened. They have a little plaque and everything. Okay, and in the story, it describes a prophetic contest. Both Elijah and the prophets of Baal, they kind of try to bring down fire from heavens, okay, from their respective gods to consume the sacrifice. Okay, and what we're told, again, I'm condensing, right, is that Elijah wins, and in the aftermath of his great victory, whatever, he murders a bunch of Baal prophets. Okay, and we are told that this is maybe okay because this is in retaliation for Jezebel's murder of the many prophets of Yahweh. Okay, and really with Jezebel and Elijah, what you get is kind of tit for tat. Whatever Jezebel does, Elijah will do, and vice versa. Okay, the second major battle between the two religious fanatics is really concerns the kind of wrongful taking over of Naboth's garden, and it's described in 1 Kings 21. Okay, in 1 Kings 21, we are told that there's this guy named Naboth who has like a super nice vineyard. Okay, that King Ahab wants. Okay, Ahab, of course, is Jezebel's husband. Okay, however, because land in Israel was seen as all owned by Yahweh. Okay, really, the Israelites are kind of like the recent tenants. Okay, human kings, you couldn't just take land that you wanted, despite being a king. Okay, that this was seen as an affront to God himself. Okay, of course, Jezebel is a foreigner, and what does she know, right? What we are told is that she illegally frames Naboth, gets him killed, so that she can take the garden and give it to her beloved, I guess, husband Ahab. Okay, and we are told for this that Yahweh is so angered that Yahweh sends Elijah to Ahab, telling him not only foretelling the end of his line, but foretelling the kind of dismal end of Jezebel, who terrible things are going to happen to. Okay. Again, notice the biased portrait of Elijah, okay, or the biased portrait of these characters in the biblical text. Elijah and his prophets, okay, is depicted as the pious defenders of Yahweh, the true God, against, who is kind of arrayed against this evil witch, Jezebel, who is everything bad, right? Elijah is the one who stands up for the oppressed, the poor, someone like Naboth, okay, while Jezebel is the powerful queen who just kind of defrauds the people. Okay, she's also, of course, a heretic. Okay. However, again, you want to be very careful, right? Because of course, the text is not an unbiased text. Okay, that there's a particular motivation undergirding it. Okay, and of course, as you'll see in the next video, this motivation or this bias, it is the most apparent when the biblical text turns to describe the contrasting fates of these contrasting characters, Elijah and Jezebel.